Howdy, this is Jim Rutt, and this is The Jim Rutt Show. Listeners have asked us to provide pointers to some of the resources we talk about on the show. We now have links to books and articles referenced in recent podcasts that are available on our website. We also offer full transcripts. Go to jimruttshow.com. That's jimruttshow.com. Today's guest is Nick Humphrey. Nick is Emeritus Professor of Psychology at the London School of Economics and is a senior member of Darwin College, Cambridge. Welcome, Nick.
Hello, good morning.
Yeah, looking forward to this conversation. Nick's the author of a long list of books on the science of consciousness and related topics, and I've recently added one of them, Seeing Red, to my reading stack. Today we're going to take a deep dive into 2023 book Sentience, the Invention of Consciousness. And despite the deep dive into the topic, this is really a quite accessible volume and includes plenty of grounding in real-life experiences of the author. I probably added 5 new ideas to ponder from reading it, so don't be afraid to pick it up. And as regular listeners know, the science of consciousness has been a long-term interest of mine. We've had on guests like Anil Seth, Bernie Bars, Yosha Bach, Antonio Damasio, Christoph Koch, Emery Brown, and others. And of course, as usual, links to those will be on our episode page at jimruttshow.com. And since I booked this episode with Nick, something has occurred in my life which makes this even more central to my thinking. That's, as some of you know, I've taken on a new gig as chairman of the California Institute of Machine Consciousness. And this has gotten me digging back into this literature in considerable depth, which I haven't done in a few years, other than to read the occasional book from my podcast. So listeners can expect a steady stream of new episodes on this topic. So now let's get down to it. Sort of before we dig into the book in detail, one of the things you get into early is you mention that the book is Sentience, and then you talk about it as the invention of consciousness. An obvious question comes up on your distinction between sentience and consciousness. So let's start there.
Yes, I think it's actually a very important one to make, especially in the context of the possibility of consciousness in machines. I think we should restrict the term sentience to what philosophers have called phenomenal consciousness. That's the sensory consciousness, the quality of conscious experience, which goes with eating, drinking, smelling, having sex, the feel of the color red, the pain of a bee sting, that sort of consciousness, which is really only associated with sensation in human beings. Now, consciousness also has a wider definition. John Locke, a long time ago, defined it as consciousness is the perception of what passeth in a man's own mind. And I think that's quite a good definition for cognitive science and for philosophy, the perception of what's happening in one's own mind. In other words, if we know that we're having a particular mental state, we're conscious of it. And I think that's quite a good general definition. But it covers a lot more than we would call sentience. We're conscious of memories, thoughts, intentions, beliefs, etc., which don't have that particular qualitative content. And if they don't have that, they don't matter to us in the same way. I mean, we don't have a view about what it's like to see that the door is shut or whatever it may be. We do have a view about what it's like to have the salt on our tongue or red light at our eyes. And when we talk about machine consciousness, of course, that's what we're really thinking about. Do machines feel in that way? And of course, when it comes to animals, that's the major question too, because it's sentience or phenomenal consciousness, which would seem to have moral weight. If an animal feels like that, then perhaps we need to care about it in a way which we should care about all sentient beings. If it's merely cognitively conscious, well, good for it. It'll be an interesting individual machine to interact with, but it's not going to be something which we need to give rights to or to think of as being in that respect like us.
You take on Ned Block's old distinction between access consciousness or a-consciousness and phenomenal consciousness or p-consciousness, which people still talk about a fair bit in the area of consciousness science. Give me your take on where he didn't get it quite right.
Yeah, I think Ned really cleared the pitch, and I think it was actually my mistake to even to try to continue to use his term phenomenal consciousness. But that's been in use a long time. It goes back to the 18th century, and so I wasn't going to allow Ned to take it over and define it his way. Ned Block, back 20, 30 years ago now, drew what he thought was a crucial distinction between access consciousness, which means introspective consciousness, the mental states of which we're aware, and he thought that sensations, phenomenal consciousness, were not accessible in that respect. It was a very strange thing to suggest, because if we can't access phenomenal consciousness, how do we know we've got it, and why does it matter to us? In lots of ways, it was an incoherent distinction, but it's permeated the field, and it's become very annoying to others who want to talk clearly about phenomenal consciousness as a real biological phenomenon, something which really changes and matters to our lives, which we do have access to, and which has these magical qualities which we need to explain from an evolutionary point of view, or if we were thinking about machines, to explain in an engineering point of view. How could a machine come to have that sort of consciousness? If the machine had no access to it, if it was pure P consciousness, just somewhere hidden in the depths of the machinery, but no subject there who knew it was conscious in that way, it really wouldn't count and it really wouldn't matter. Ned and I've fallen out about that, and he won't agree with me. I'm not going to pretend I agree with him, but I do think maybe we need to change the terminology. That's why sentience is in some ways a better word for phenomenal consciousness, except that, of course, people have used that in various ways too. The language is not clean.
It's one of the things I have relearned as I stuck my head back into these wars over the last couple of months is, man, I've recommended to the CIMC folks that one of our first projects is to create a glossary about what we mean by these various terms. Because, you go to a meeting on consciousness and you can spend the first half day just getting people's definitions aligned.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right, Jeremy. I mean, I've just come from a conference on AI and sentience. Artificial intelligence and sentience took place in Heraclea in Crete 2 weeks ago. We did spend the first day trying to agree about what we were talking about. And I came from another meeting on the evolution of consciousness. My paper was the question, the evolution of what? We've got to get our terms clear, and we need to know, what it is we mean functionally in terms of the kind of things we could measure and test before we can begin to talk about whether or not it exists in animals or in machines. I'll tell you something. The field of consciousness studies has been going backwards in some respects. 20 or 30 years ago, people were beginning to talk sensibly about it. A lot of time had been put in by philosophers, psychologists, cognitive scientists in saying, what are meaningful questions? What can we really ask? What kinds of questions can we answer by experiments, for example? Daniel Dennett was very important in that respect. But after all that work, once the new phase of consciousness studies took off just in the last 10, 15 years, everybody's been getting in on the act, and they really haven't learnt the lessons which were so hard won back then. And so I think the field is a bit of a mess at the moment. It's very hard to assess what people really mean by things.
It is very much the case. And also, as you point out, in the last, 20 years, 25 years, ideas that seem way out there keep coming, right? And one of our positions we've chosen at CIMC is to ring fence off an area of ideas to consider. For instance, we have chosen to rule out Penrose hammer-off, right? And probably more controversially, we have decided to rule off Tononi, etc.
And I'm very pleased to hear that, because I think not many people are taking that risk of going against the grain. I mean, these ideas are very popular, panpsychist ideas, which, whether it's outright panpsychism of the kind of you get from Philip Goff or Gerhard Strawson, or the covert panpsychism of Tononi and Koch, which I think is equally, in a sense, incoherent and dangerous to scientific studies. It's muddying the waters. Nonetheless, of course, because it's so romantic and in some sense, just because it's so crazy, people latch onto it and love to talk about it. I mean, I think in a way, there are so many bad ideas out there, and you wonder why people hold them. And I think in a way, I fall back on, the Roman emperors, Tertullian's adage that I believe because it's impossible. It's just because it all seems so mad and crazy. We like to say that a teacup could be conscious or the sun could be conscious. There's a nice riff which Nietzsche put on that. He said, "I believe because I am impossible," and I often think this applies to some of our leading consciousness experts like Christoph Koch.
He was a really smart guy. I've had him on my podcast.
Yeah, I know you only have smart guys on our podcast, but nonetheless, smart guys can get it wrong.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, very much so. And of course, as you know, having been in this field longer than almost anybody, the domain of consciousness attracts cranks like manure attracts flies, right? And in fact, one of the reasons I did agree to become involved with the California Institute for Machine Consciousness is it looks like at least a possible vector to get down to something that's actually empirically verifiable. If we can actually create a machine consciousness, of course, we have to know that we have, what is the standard for that, which we still don't have. But once we have it, the beauty of a machine consciousness is you can instrument it all to hell, right? You can actually look at it at a microsecond by microsecond basis and see what's going on. So you could actually say real, reproducible things about it, which are really hard to do in animal consciousness at a fine grain, at least. And so,
but I think you made an important point just at the beginning there when you say it attracts flies like to a field of manure. It's the fact that consciousness studies is so fascinating is, I think, an important clue to what we're talking about. And in fact, I've argued in the past that actually one of the functions of consciousness is, in a sense, to make us believe that we exist outside of nature and beyond scientific explanation. Now, why would that be a valuable belief to hold? Because it gives us a metaphysical importance which we couldn't otherwise pretend to. And then once we have that kind of self-importance, look at me, look at the kind of thing which happens inside my head, all this astonishing qualitative magic which seems to have no basis in physical reality. That gives me a sense of myself which is a very important and valuable one. It gives me not only a sense of my own importance, but of the importance of other beings like myself, other human beings whom I recognize to have an equal right to think of themselves as centers of this mystery. Now, I'm an evolutionist, and so you might well wonder, okay, if it makes humans think of themselves as so special, what's it doing for chimpanzees or dogs or mice for that matter? That's an important question too. And in my evolutionary story, I have to do some clever footwork around the origins of consciousness, because it didn't originally have that role, but certainly in people like ourselves, beings like ourselves, one of its functions has been to lift us above reality. Nietzsche said art exists in order to save us from materialism. I think that consciousness exists in a way to save us from a material view of what it's like to be a human being. But that doesn't mean that this mythology, this wonderful myth we have about what consciousness is doing, is technically right. It's, of course, not right. I am as much flesh and blood as any animal, and any animal is as much material as any rock or stone. In the end, that's where it comes from. But this wonderful myth we have about ourselves, which is generated by consciousness, it's why we get up in the morning.
It's a very interesting, is the noble lie necessary? It's a different question, which I've had a couple of podcasts on recently. And interestingly, there are people who say, yes, the noble lie is necessary, but we'll leave that for another day.
Okay.
As I was reading the book, one of the things that came to mind is actually I went back and checked, and it's a quote you did not use, but it's Dobzhansky's famous line, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." One of the things I loved about this book, and so many people in this area wave a flag at it but don't take it seriously, is that consciousness, it's an emergence from biology, approximately, right? It must earn its way. It's been around for a couple 100 million years at least, maybe longer. We'll talk about that later. It had to have paid its way, right? And, evolution is a game about things that pay their way and things that don't, right? Consciousness is expensive energetically. It's probably expensive in genetic information, almost certainly has to be. In Evo Devo, there's lots and lots of biological costs. And yet not only has it persisted for this from deep time, but it appears to have gotten better and better and better over time.
And there must have been payoff at every step of the way. It's like, the paradox, or not the paradox, the problem Darwin realized early on was that of the really sophisticated things which we marvel at in biological nature, like, let's say, the evolution of the human eye, you have to be able to get to an eye like that of a monkey or a cat from a pinhole camera which exists in the beginnings of it in a worm. So what are all the intermediate stages? At every stage, it must have worked that much better. It must have had a payoff which really made a difference to the animal's life. So we need to see every stage of consciousness as having been adaptive in that respect.
Yeah, it's as you say, the chain of being has to be connected all the way back from Luca, right? All the way back from our last universal common ancestor. And, just a total aside, I just, every once in a while I focus on this, every one of us is the last leaf on an unbelievably unlikely chain, right? That our parents never failed, ever, all the way back for 3.5 billion years to have offspring that lived. And, the graph of that which could have been but wasn't is way larger than the graph of things that are. And that gives you kind of like a tingly feeling and a sense of responsibility.
It does, and it's actually it's because you might think that there have been so many reasons for individuals to have given up. I mean, I've written, for example, about the psychology of suicide, and I write about why ending it can be so attractive for humans. You'd only have to be that much, just a little too depressed, and realize you could simply opt out of it. It's all too easy. And yet we know that none of our direct ancestors ever did that before the age of 15 or so anyway.
And of course, it's also interesting. This is something in my own thinking about this domain is always think about things pre-human. The other bad attractor in consciousness studies is to over-index on the human.
Mm-hmm.
We have the advantage that humans have words, right? They have introspection, which you talk about a fair bit. I always test an idea. Okay, what about a chimpanzee? What about a dog? What about a white-tailed deer, right?
Yeah, it's a good rule to have in mind, but we must be careful not to assume that it's continuous all the way down. If we were to take a capacity like human language, for example, there really is nothing comparable to that amongst animals. And therefore, if we were talking about language, we have to realize that something happened in the history of human beings which simply would produce a kind of phase shift in the way the mind works. And the same, I think, is to some extent true of consciousness. Maybe we'll get onto that later on.
We'll definitely get it. Chapter 14 is the center of the book. I think, is it 14 or 12? Anyway, I got my notes here. And we go into that funky term that you coined, which as far as I can tell, nobody else has picked up. And we're going to talk about that in fair depth because the all or nothing attractor. I love this. Whether it's right or not, I don't know, but you've now obsessed me with this topic. So this is really cool.
Jim, I have to defer to you about attractors. You know an awful lot about physics and maths of attractors, which I probably don't. So yes, okay, we'll get to that.
Yeah, and I do use attractor metaphorically often, so I have no problem with that at all. Maybe talk a little bit about some of your earlier experiences with phosphenes, etc., just as a way to start thinking.
In this book, it's different from some of my other books because in order to introduce the topics, I go back to my own history of how I got into being fascinated by this subject or that. And so, yeah, I take it right back to when I was an undergraduate and was thrown in at the deep end by my supervisor in being invited, or the first time I met him, to stand in a bucket of saline alongside him and have electric probes put directly onto my eye. And the point would be to show that you don't have to have light to generate visual experiences. You can do it directly by electrical stimulation. It was something which, amazingly, had been experimented with by Newton a few hundred years earlier, back in the same part of Cambridge University where I was a student. So yeah, I became fascinated early on in how in sensation, how the particular modalities of sensation get established. What's the difference between light and sound and smell and taste? Why can't you move smoothly, let's say, from experiences of visual sensations to auditory ones? There seems to be a strange and interesting gulf between them. They're all sensations. They all have that phenomenal quality, which sets them apart from all the other phenomena in the universe. Nonetheless, they're each of them kind of islands of experience. So that was something I've thought about from the very beginning of my career as a experimental psychologist. And then I go on to discuss experiments I did with monkeys on Blindsight, and then
Yeah, let's talk about that. I did not realize that you were actually the discoverer of Blindsight.
Yeah, I discovered something which was was the first example of it, which seemed absolutely clear and convincing. It wasn't called Blindsight in those days because it was work I was doing on rhesus monkey, which had her visual cortex removed by my research supervisor in Cambridge. I mean, just by a bit of luck, really. I had the chance to work with this monkey who'd been blind for a year before I met her, and discovered that she wasn't as blind as anybody thought. She wasn't even as blind as she thought. And that was what was interesting, because I could persuade her.
Yeah, that was the important point.
Yeah, I could persuade her that, in fact, she was able to see. And so I got to work with this one monkey for 7 years. And it was quite a big, major experience in my life to, in a sense, be the midwife to this development of vision in a blind animal, but not ordinary vision. That was what was so remarkable. It turned out to be what we now think of as unconscious or insensate vision. Helen, this monkey, wasn't in the visual sphere, was not sentient. She didn't have sensations. It wasn't like anything for her to see. And how do we know that? Because as a result of this work, it was possible to, people asked new questions about human beings with the same kind of brain damage, and discovered this remarkable phenomenon, which Larry Weisskranz coined the term for. He called it blindsight, unconscious vision.
And we now know other things, for instance, our ability to react to a ball coming at our face happens faster than a signal can come up the whole perceptual stack, which typically takes 80 milliseconds or something. And so there, presumably are other circuits that come out of areas at the lowest level of vision that sends some form of low-grade signal to some part of our cognitive processes.
But it's not necessarily so low grade. I mean, it's been shown the blindsight patient can read, for example, even while saying that there's nothing there, it's not seeing anything. And what the question it raises, and it's an evolutionary question in the end, is if we can perceive, take in cognitively the information and act on it and make decisions on the basis of it about vision, or it might be about touch or smell or anything else, without having any corresponding conscious sensation, then why do we have the sensation? What's it for? What's it doing? Why did nature indulge in this extravagance, apparently, of giving us not only perception, a cognitive ability, but phenomenal consciousness and the sensory quality which goes with it? So that's what I've been working on. I did this, I hardly dare say, the experiments with Helen, what I began in 1966, I think, quite a time ago. But it set me up on a course of asking questions about consciousness, which I've stuck to more or less ever since. I've made some diversions, but that's been my love, my interest in answering the question of what are sensations for.
And how do sensations fit into the broader architecture? Just as a little aside, it seems like you had a quite rich personal relationship with Helen.
Yeah. As I say, I worked with her over 7 years. She started in Cambridge with me. I then moved to Oxford. She came to Oxford with me, then back to the Animal Behavior Lab in Cambridge, and all the time what was peculiar about this relationship was that she was developing an ability which astonished her, apparently, and astonished everyone else around it. Nobody believed that Helen could see in that way, and it seemed to just go against everything we knew about the physiology of the brain. So that was very important. Personally, she became, in a way, I wouldn't say a pet animal. It was not the right word to use about a monkey. She wasn't like a dog. But nonetheless, we knew each other pretty well. And I would take her for walks around the fields around Mattingly. And those were in the days when we were still allowed to do that. Today, you wouldn't be allowed to take a monkey on a lead around Mattingly anymore. But anyway, so we worked together. And that was, this literally, by taking her for walks, by encouraging her to do things which I was doing, climbing a tree or whatever it might be. It was through that experience that she slowly recovered her ability to see. And that's actually a very important lesson for science. You don't find things out if you stay just within the confines of a lab. You need to bring animals into the environment to which they are adapted, and then they'll begin to show you what they can really do.
I will say Helen was lucky to have you as her experimenter.
She was lucky for not forever, I should say. If I hadn't stepped in, she would probably have been, as the experimenters use the term, she would have been sacrificed. That people wanted to see her brain and see what had become of the brain after the brain lesion. She had at least 7 years more with me because we put that off. Not forever in the end. In the end, Harry Weisskant, it was his monkey. He'd operated on it. He wanted to do the histology and get the brain anatomy. And so I went away, and he and his colleague came over and dispatched the animal, and that was it. It was a very sad event for me. People do bring up, how could I have been involved in work which involved, firstly, making a monkey blind, even if I showed that she could in fact recover a good deal of sight. And it's a tricky question. I wouldn't do it again, I don't think. And in fact, that kind of experimental work on blindness in monkeys would not be allowed in the United Kingdom or the United States.
Yeah, it is a sign of our moral progress. We still have further to go, but we are treating our close evolutionary relatives a lot better than we were 50 years ago.
Yeah, it's not true all over the world. I mean, what do we say about that? The fact is that in Japan, they are doing similar experiments. In China, they are doing them now. Everybody is very interested in the results from a scientific point of view, and yet we wouldn't do them in our own labs anymore. We could talk about that in another.
Interesting and difficult question.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to a result which I was not aware of, which I found very interesting, and that's the work on color preferences in monkeys.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, this follows on almost directly. After I decided 6 or so years after I began research that I'd had enough of working on monkeys with brain damage. I did some other work unrelated to the stuff with Helen too. I made single recordings, cell recordings from monkeys' brains and so on. I wanted an out from that. And so I decided to do research on what monkeys would like to have happen to them, not what we were imposing on them, or not when they became the subject of our experiments, but when, in a sense, they were allowed to experiment with the world and discover it for themselves. And so I decided to look into aesthetic preferences in monkeys. Given the chance, what would they like to look at or listen to or smell or whatever it may be? It was very ambitious. I mean, of course, I thought of this as possibly providing a basis for the evolution of artistry and all the things which we think of as so important for humans. It was much too ambitious. The monkeys I worked with showed no signs of aesthetic sensitivity at all. No, try as I might, I couldn't get them to take an interest in art or music or any higher levels of visual patterning, which we would call beautiful. But they did show strong feelings about elementary aspects of sensation. And in particular, I think no one had thought of it before, certainly never noticed it, they showed astonishingly strong feelings about colors, much stronger than we humans do. It followed the spectrum, basically. They really hated red light, and they loved the blue end of the spectrum, or the colors fell in between. So that a monkey would become seriously upset if it was confined to a room which was colored red. Its hair would stand on end, it would start urinating, it would get upset and fidgety and so on. Put it in a blue room and it would calm down. So I spent some years trying to find out what was going on here. What's the basis for this preference? Why, from an evolutionary point of view, might it have arisen in monkeys, which are not distant relations of ourselves? And is there any evidence of a similar reaction in human beings, even if it's not as strong? It turns out that there is. Some conditions can hugely exaggerate people's feelings about colors, and they follow then very much the pattern of the monkeys, and they get very upset by red light, and they feel calmed.
Now, a final aside before we get into the theory part, and that is your experience with gorillas, and you're then leading to a hypothesis around social intelligence as one of the things that our good friend evolution has used to ratchet up our sentience.
Well, that was another lucky break, I think. I mean, I was very lucky early in my research career. I came back from Oxford to the Cambridge Mattingly Department of Animal Behavior. Now, that was a research place which studied animals in nature, animal behavior in the wild. And we had a lot of field researchers coming in and out of it. Jane Goodall was a student there, and other famous primatologists, among whom was the great Diane Fossey. Diane Fossey was a student of Robert Hind in my department, and I met her when she came back she had to find it to write up her PhD, which had been based on research in the Virunga Mountains in Rwanda. She was in the lab in a very gloomy state, sitting at a desk late at night trying to finish this dreadful PhD, which of course was not her cup of tea at all. She liked being out in the field anyhow, but I got to know her quite well. And out of that came an invitation to go and visit. And as it happened, I had a break in what I was doing, and so I was able to go out and visit Diane Fossey in Kantvisoki, her centre in Virunga volcanoes, and spent 3 months there. I didn't really have a project when I went out there, but I soon developed one because, can I tell this story at some length? It's an interesting one. I needed some funding to send me out to Africa with her, and it turned out that there was a project which I could take on with rather little experience. There were a group of dead gorillas in the camp. They'd been killed by poachers. The skeletons were lying around in bags. The bodies were in bags, and nobody had got round to doing any anatomical observations on them. And gorillas are quite rare. Mountain gorillas are quite rare, and it's very important to do proper measurements of their skulls and their bones. And so I got a grant from the Royal Society, basically, to pay my way in order to go and make measurements of the skulls of these gorillas. Meant that in the first days and weeks I was there, I spent a rather surprising time boiling up gorilla bodies and carcasses in a big cauldron and stripping the flesh from their bones and using my calipers and making all these detailed measurements. Now, how could I not be impressed by what was in front of me? These animals had huge skulls, really colossal skulls, bigger than human being skulls, and of course, that meant that they had rather large brains, not as big as human brains as it happens, but nonetheless very much bigger than the brain of a monkey. Once I did those measurements, I wrote them up. I, in fact, published a paper in Nature after them quite quickly. But what it set me up for was to ask new questions once I got into the forest and could observe the animals in the wild, because what struck me immediately about mountain gorillas is that there was nothing for them to do. Life was amazingly easy for them. They have no enemies to speak of except human poachers, and they're on the whole, they could escape or get out of the way of those. There are no other predators. Life was food was abundant. Life was apparently easy and comfortable, and all they did was lie around, as I thought, chewing away on the vegetation and burping and lying and enjoying life in the sun. What do you need a big brain for that for? I mean, you could do that with an ant's brain. And yet these gorillas had huge cerebral organs in their heads. Now, what are brains for? They're, of course, for thinking, and therefore the basis for intelligence. So there must be something going on in the gorillas' lives which was requiring intelligence of a high order, which I simply wasn't picking up from. Their life could not be as simple as it appeared to be. And then it dawned on me. Well, firstly, it dawned on me to think, supposing I was in their place, what would I be thinking about? As any young man, out of his being university and I was a student, of course what I thought about was all my friends and my girlfriends and my relationships and all the problems they'd been causing me and the things which were going on still in Cambridge while I was sitting in the jungle. And so I was musing away on what it's like to be a person and to live in a human community. And then I looked at the gorillas again, and I saw that exactly the same seemed to be happening for them. This life of theirs was nothing like so simple as I thought it seemed to be. Looking closely, I saw that there were endless disputes going on, endless fights over dominance, jealousies, rivalries going on, squabbles about access to food, and later on about access to mates, and so on. And so I realized, okay, life is not that easy. In order to maintain what seems a simple existence, they have to be doing something quite extraordinary. They have to be psychologists. They have to understand and be able to relate to other animals like themselves in a complex social group, just as we humans have to do. And out of that came a new idea, which was that it was actually social life which had driven the evolution of the brains of the higher apes like us and like chimpanzees and gorillas. Nobody thought of it that way before. Nobody put social intelligence, but at least the word social and intelligence together. Social psychology was a kind of poor country cousin of of experimental psychology and really rather uninteresting and absurd. And nobody in their right mind studied social psychology. And yet everybody studied intelligence. How could they relate to each other? And then I saw that actually it's a social world where intelligence really comes into its own. That's what we need our brains for. That's where all the things which we pride ourselves on in relation to mathematics and science and exploration and decision-making and imagination, it's where they really come into their own. It's when we're dealing with other people. And so I coined the term natural psychology. I said that humans and gorillas too have had to evolve to be natural psychologists. But how do they do it? They don't do it just by being clever. I don't think that's going to be enough. Psychology is a very difficult subject to do, as we have all increasingly discovered in the experimental field. Predicting the behavior of another human being is probably predicting the behavior of the most complex thing in the universe, and gorillas and chimpanzees aren't far behind. How do we do it? Well, I thought, and whereas the way I do it is that I imagine what it would be like if I was in the place of wherever it is that I'm trying to predict. And then how do I do that? And why can I do that? It's because I know what it's like to be me. And I know what it's like to be me because I have a particular kind of consciousness. I have all these experiences running through my head within the framework of a mental model, which I call my mind. And I can project that onto other creatures like myself. And so I began to see theory of mind as being the most important aspect of the way the mind works. We have our mind in order to understand the minds of others like ourselves. So that gave me quite a new take on consciousness and even on the things which had fascinated me from the start about things like experience of colors and pains and emotions and so on.
Yeah, it's interesting, of course, that this social ratchet appeared again, probably, with the evolution of human language. Robin Dunbar,
Absolutely.
his work on gossip as a reasonable contender for the ratchet up, or, my favorite alternative one is seduction, right? So we know that anything that's sexually selected can ramp very quickly, peacock's tails, etc. And so, who knows, maybe 17-year-old guys and 18-year and 16-year-old girls were the real inventors of language as they sparred with each other on who was going to get to mate with who.
Yeah, well, Geoffrey Miller's made precisely that suggestion in his book, The Mating Mind.
Yeah, that reminds me, I have to have Jeffrey on. I've emailed him back and forth a few times, but I'll have to close him out. You mentioned theory of mind, the mirror test, which, some people argue is a good measure of theories of mind. Do gorillas pass the mirror test? I don't recall.
They don't, which is a bit of a puzzle. I mean, mirror test is a very ingenious idea, and when Gordon Gallup invented it, I think everybody was bowled over by the fact that not only that chimpanzees could pass it, this is the ability to recognize oneself in a mirror, which we shouldn't have been surprised, of course, really, but nonetheless, it was the first evidence that an animal could do it. But what's more, that dogs couldn't, for example, and rhesus monkeys couldn't. So it seemed to be drawing a rather sharp line between the ability, the sense of self which exists for higher primates like the apes, and that which we assume is also present, but not to that degree in other animals. And obviously, it's clearly related to social life again. The ability to recognize oneself in the mirror is very similar to the ability to recognize someone else as being like oneself. It's not turned out to be an entirely reliable test. It seems to be there are reasons why some animals which we expect to pass it really don't, I think, and perhaps it's also easy. It's a test which other animals can cheat on without really having a sense of self. But nonetheless, it was a very important new tool in the armory of developmental psychology to see at what point do humans and what point do animals begin to recognize themselves in mirrors, because that suggests they have a sense of being themselves, a conscious, existing being.
And if gorillas don't pass the test, then, and in your hypothesis, social intelligence is correct, and that it's based on theory of mind, then there must be some theory of mind process that doesn't manifest in the mirror test.
Yeah, and I think it's to do with that mirrors are very strange objects in a way. I mean, we take them for granted in our environment, but You look in yourself and you and I say, yeah, that's me. But it's not me, of course. What happens? It's an illusion, and to get to the idea that what's present when you look in the mirror is you is in fact a kind of bizarre paradox. And I think that some animals simply get hung up on that. They're actually in some sense too sophisticated. They realize perfectly well, okay, there's something in the mirror which has some curious resemblances to me, but of course it can't be me. But now what to do with that idea next? And so you have to sense to suspend disbelief in order to pass the mirror test.
It's funny. Dogs generally ignore themselves in the mirror. But we had one dachshund, famously dumb, not smart dog at all, but he barked at himself in the mirror because he thought it was another dog.
Yeah, dogs. It's very interesting. The real breed differences in dogs. It's well known that collies pass, for example, poodles do. I don't know what your dumb dog was, but other dogs like Labradors seem never to get it.
Yeah, our labs totally ignored the mirror, but they didn't attack the mirror either. The dachshund attacked the mirror, thought it was another dog. Right? I think the labs just say, I don't know what the hell that is. I'm just not interested in it. Right? Interesting. Well, one other question that had brought up when I was reading the gorilla chapter, which is, what about orangutans, right? They do indeed live an essentially non-social life, and yet they have cognitive power and brain-body ratios, I think higher than gorillas, lower than chimps.
And they pass the mirror test. Yeah, I think orangutans are a very interesting and I suspect a very special case. My hypothesis about orangutans is that what we're seeing is an aberration. They weren't always like that. I suspect that they probably got to the islands where they now live from the mainland, from on boats taken by human beings. They'd been adopted as pets or whatever it is and taken across there. So they effectively were orphans. They didn't have the social life that their cousins and ancestors on the mainland had had, where I suspect they were at a much more complex and interesting society. They, in a sense, once they got to Borneo or wherever it was, began to behave rather like what people find out later happens to a monkey if you bring it up without a mother. They become isolated, unable to relate to others, unable to be good mothers to their own children and so on. And so I think that, like Harlow's Motherless Mothers, the infants which reached the islands basically had got off on a very bad trajectory, and basically and all orangutans maybe have inherited that absence and that strange kind of isolation as a result of that. It's only a hypothesis, but it's taken seriously by some anthropologists. It is such a puzzle, and there's also reason when we know that orangutans did live on the mainland in China before they went out to these relatively isolated islands, and then are extinct on the mainland. So we just don't know what their life was like on the mainland.
Presumably, you could look at whether there was a keyhole effect on the genetics of the island orangs, and if it corresponded to, say, 40,000 years ago, that might be a reasonable hypothesis that supports a bit of evidence to support this. Anyway, that's totally off the subject. It's just something that was raised in my mind as reading things. Now let's dig in back into the real theory aspects here, and that is, the key distinctions that you start to make around chapter 10 on the distinctions between, in detail, you referenced them earlier, between sensation and perception. You can take as much time as you want to lay that picture out.
Well, since it's the best way of explaining that, and the reason I didn't do it this way in the book, is to take the case of blindsight. Blindsight is a case of perception without, in the absence of sensation. And so what the cases of blindsight do is to basically drive a wedge between these two concepts. We have to recognize that they can be dissociated. You can have perception and perceptual consciousness without sensory consciousness. And as I said, for me, the central question came in why, in that case, do we have sensory consciousness, phenomenal experience? And in the book, I take that as the question to pursue. Ask, well, how could this strange phenomenon have come into being, this way of representing what's happening at my sense organs? What I say, perception and sensation, let me say this again, are both representations. When I look at a red tomato, for example, I have a sensation of redness, for example, which is a sensation it's representing what the light coming to that from the tomato to my eyes is like. How is it affecting me? I also perceive the tomato as having the color red, being the same color as a pillar box or whatever. It might be a physical description of it, which is basically a description of its objective properties. Perception is a perception of is a representation of what's out there in the world. Sensation is a representation of what's happening to me and how is this object interacting with me. So on the basis of that, I then go back to sensation and ask, how did it begin and what kind of history could we reinvent speculatively to get from very early evidence of animals reacting in a feeling, in a value assessing way to stimuli impacting their bodies. What did it mean for them? How do we get from that all the way up to the kinds of experiences which we now have and value so much in interacting with the sensory world? And so it's been a long story there, but it's based all along in I think it all makes sense, and we can guess how it would have occurred in evolution, starting with animals' simple affective responses to stimuli, how the animal came to read what was happening to it by asking, what am I doing about it? The trick about representing sensations, it's not true of perception. The way about sensations is if you want to know what you feel about pain, you look at how you're responding to it. You're making a motor response to your body surface, you're reacting with a wriggle of avoidance or whatever it may be, you're withdrawing, you're making an affective response, and you know what you're responding to by what you're doing about it. So sensation began as a process of response, as something we do rather than something we feel. But we came to feel it by monitoring what we ourselves were doing about it. And so I build up from that to ask, well, once you get that as the basis for representing what's going on, what would we expect to happen next? And I trace a story by which I show that the initial responses we were making to light, sounds, colors, and so on could have become internalized. They became internalized because the animal in the past who'd been making these responses was becoming more sophisticated. It was growing up and evolving in other ways. It didn't want to go on making the primitive responses that its ancestors had done, let's say to red light or to being touched on the skin. And yet it still wanted to represent what was happening to it. And so the response became internalized. Now, this is tricky to explain without having a picture to point to, but what I do in the book is to show how once you've taken that step to internalizing the response, you get a feedback loop, which can quickly become something of great significance in terms of the design of the brain, because our feedback loops can begin to have very surprising properties. And what I was looking for precisely was a surprising property. What could be the basis for qualia or phenomenal experience? How could it have acquired its magical, mysterious properties, its strange kind of temporal thickness, the fact that it seems unlike anything else in the world, the fact that we have qualitative, distinct modalities to it, and so on. And I saw in these feedback loops a route to that, because feedback loops can generate attractor states. They can but the loop, in a way, by catching its own tail, becomes a stable state with some very complex properties. Mathematicians have talked about how attractors generated by delay differential equations, which are easily mimicked and simulated in the brain, can have an astonishing range of dimensions to them. They're not just three-dimensional forms of activity. They can have potentially infinite number of dimensions. Now, that was what I was looking for in a way. I wanted something in the brain which could explain the mysteries of consciousness. And so I wanted something which has the potential for mystery. And these feedback loops with the attractor states which might go with them seemed to me a very promising area to look into. Now, at that point, my theorizing begins to lose touch with anything which we could call reality, because we don't know what's going on in the brain. It's astonishing how little we really know about what's going on in the brain, and we've yet to see these attractor states in all their glory actually occurring in the brain of a living human or a living animal, for that matter. But nonetheless, it's what I do in this, I admit, I write it's a so-called just so story, but it's a proof in principle of how you could, by simple steps in evolution, get from an early response, a wriggle of acceptance or rejection of a stimulus, right the way through to what's going on when we look at the blue sky or taste a lemon.
We'll dig into this soon. I've got a whole section on this in my notes. But before we do that...
The great thing, Jim, is that we have all this time. I love it when we can say, we'll dig into this.
Yeah, that's why I do what I do, right? I can find nothing more annoying than do 25-minute podcasts on important books. Blah, don't like it. Let somebody else do that. So before we hop into this core, so I take it away as the core idea of the book, actually, is to talk a little bit, again, about distinctions around sentience and perception and around theories of phenomenal properties. For instance, there's the illusionism idea, for instance. Maybe touch a little bit on how you would distinguish your ideas around sensation in particular versus illusionism. It's very important, I think.
Well, let's start. In a sense, we need to start with realism. There's an awful lot of philosophers and neuroscientists, for that matter, who believe that the qualities of phenomenal experience are real, in the sense that there really is something in the brain which has the quality of phenomenal redness or phenomenal pain or whatever it is. It goes back to the old idea of an identity between brain states and conscious experience. I think this is a very misleading idea, the idea that there is a neural correlate of consciousness which actually maps on directly to the conscious experience.
Well, Kant pretty much kicked that one down the road a long time ago, right?
Okay, it was what it was. It may have been kicked down the road, but it's still a very popular idea in neuroscience, this identity theory. It's fundamentally mistaken, because what we should be talking about is representation. How does the brain represent phenomena, not how it can actually instantiate? That brings us on to, okay, if it's representing something, representing the redness of red or the sweetness of honey, whatever it is, does that mean that what it represents has real existence? Some time ago, thought that, well, okay, maybe we should just accept that it doesn't. And I used the analogy of looking at an impossible triangle, which we represent as having qualities which it really doesn't have. It's an illusion. And we can make an object which looks just like an impossible triangle. Richard Gregory invented one which he made out of wood. And, look at it from the right point of view, and you can't disabuse yourself of the fact that you're looking at a real object which nonetheless has impossible spatial features to it. That seemed to be an interesting analogy. And I thought, well, what if these circuits in the brain, which I've been speculating about, what if they generate something like impossible objects, which we then misread as having qualities which they really don't have? I was working with Dan Dennett. Dan took up the idea, and in a big way, he'd already been talking about the illusion of consciousness, and he thought this was a very nice way to talk about qualia and phenomenal experience and so on. And it's generated a big new side branch of philosophy of mind, which is called illusionism. Keith Frankish has been particularly important in developing it. I lost faith in it myself. I thought, the problem about calling phenomenal experience an illusion is that it implies, at least in the ordinary use of language, that it's a mistake, just as we're in error, that we're seeing something which is actually invalid, just as when we look at the impossible triangle and think it's something which it isn't. And yet I don't think phenomenal experience should be described like that. I think phenomenal experience is the way we feel about these things happening to our body, and those feelings have a status, even a metaphysical status, which is perfectly real. We should respect it as having an ontology of its own, which we should, not try and dismiss as being an illusion, partly because other people will misunderstand us and think, oh, well, we're saying consciousness doesn't exist or something like that, which is a criticism continually leveled against people like Dan Dennett. People ridiculed Dan Dennett's wonderful book, Consciousness Explained, as being consciousness explained away. Well, that's not what Dan was doing. He was not certainly intending to do that. He knows consciousness. He knew, Paul Dan's not here anymore, but he knew consciousness is as one of this and is the most significant aspect of human life. Nonetheless, he wanted to use the language of illusionism. And so I've now tried to pull back from that. But I continue to use language something like it. I think a much better analogy than a visual illusion or an illusory object is art. I think consciousness is like a work of art. And I talk not about illusionism, but about surrealism. In some sense, phenomenal experience is even more real than the original thing it's representing. I wrote a paper called Redder Than Red. The analogy I was drawing was with Picasso's sculpture of a goat, which he said, look at this goat, it's goatier than a real goat, isn't it? We all know what he means. And I think that when we sense red and have phenomenal experience of red, our redness is redder than real red in a way. So that puts a positive spin on these experiences, which I think we should not be shy of reintroducing. We all, the idea of consciousness as art is something which we don't have to feel worried about or think that we're dismissing it or explaining it away. No, we're not. We're putting it on a pedestal in a way which says just how astonishing the human brain is, in some sense, reinventing a new dimension of experience in the form of everyday conscious experience.
Yeah, I think you make a huge distinction here, which I agree with, so therefore it must be right? Which is that things like sensation and perception and ego, anything you might want to call conscious contents or unconscious contents, are as real as a rock. And I call this emergent naturalism, essentially. And the mistake that people make, and I think this is a relatively simple error that if people would correct, they'd be as smart as you and I about this topic, which is things don't have to be static things. My coffee cup is a static thing, right? Dynamical patterns are as real as the coffee cup, right? And what is the things going on in our body, neuronal body chemical system? It's a very complex dance of dynamics, but it is not a random dance. It is driven by homeostasis. It's driven by attractor states, we're going to talk about in a minute. And these patterns are every bit as real and as manifestations of the evolution of the universe as my coffee cup is. And not seeing that is what I would describe as the root of the error of people who say things like consciousness or the perception of red or the sensation of red, to use your language, is not real. Very real. And it has consequences, has causality, right?
Nice way to put it, Jim. But nonetheless, be careful, because soon, otherwise, you'll find you get adopted by the other philosophical realists, who in a kind of Cartesian way think there's a world of experience, a kind of dualist world, which corresponds to the physical world alongside it. It's not that. This is part of the physical world.
This is materialist emergence. I am absolutely an anti-Platonian, so they will never suck me into idealism ever. It just ain't happened, nor dualism, right? So don't worry about me falling into those two bad attractors. Naturalist emergence it explains it all. It's all you need to know, people. All the rest is just working out the problem, right? Obviously not quite true. All right, now let's get to, for me at least, was the meat of the book, which is your concept of ipsundrum. How do you pronounce that?
It's probably not a great word, but I got stuck with it. I talked about the real impossible triangle, which was an object made by Richard Gregory. And great British psychologist. He made it out of wood, and it's clever construction. I'm sure you've seen it, which, if you look at it just from the right point of view, seems to have these impossible qualities. It's not like the impossible triangle drawn on paper, which of course is clearly an illusion. This object is out there in space and appears to have these special characteristics. And talking to Gregory about what I said, your object needs a name. I mean, it's a wonderful thing. That we can't just let it sort of float away and without out christening it. So why don't we call it the Gregundrum, which is meant to be an amalgam of Gregory and conundrum. So there we got the Gregundrum. That's the name I give, and he adopted for this object. So we have something like a Gregundrum in our brain, but it's not made by Richard Gregory. It's made by us, Ipsos, Ipsi, myself. So I said, let's call the thing that I create in my brain an Epsandrum, a conundrum created by myself. But I wanted a name for it because I think it's a real thing. Just as you were saying, it's a pattern, but it's a real pattern. Maybe what I've later called a mathematical object rather than a physical object as such. Nonetheless, let's give it a name, and I called it the Epsandrum. Words matter, I know, and it hasn't been widely taken it up, but then nor have most of my ideas in this area, so there we are. But nonetheless, yes, you asked about the Epsandrum, and that's what it is. That's how I pronounce it.
Okay, yeah, cool. I would just add, I'm going to suggest gently that rather than making a distinction between a physical object and a mathematical object, I would, for an attractor like this, I'd call it a dynamical object, because it's not mathematical. Mathematical is how we describe it. The thing itself is a series of feedback loops and signals and adaptations within adaptations and adaptations. And its essence is its dynamical systems attribute, not its mathematical attribute.
Right. Okay. Corrected.
See if that works for you in the future. I think it will. I think it exactly says what you're trying to say. So now you actually back to our earlier talk about we don't understand any of this. We don't think of it in terms of evolution. You lay out a quite nice step-by-step evolutionary narrative to get to ipsundrum. So could you tell us that story to the degree you can?
Jim, I'm not sure it's going to work without the slides I'd need. I began to sketch it out already, and how to begin with a simple reaction, which then you monitor in order to discover what you yourself feel about something. First you respond, and then you ask, what did I do? And not through that, you learn what it was that you were responding to. I build it up by saying it gets privatized, it gets to be from feedback loops, and so on. I really think this is probably some of the people, if they will, which should either look at one of there's quite a few videos in which I demonstrate this in sort of gorgeous Technicolor moving around on the screen, and there's pictures in the book which I think help explain it. Just yesterday, I got sent an e-version of the Russian edition of my book Sentience, and they've replaced all the figures in it with completely absurd drawings, which they thought represented what I meant to say. So I've been trying to get this Russian edition withdrawn.
Okay. If you could send me a link in the email to what you think is the best video representation of the evolution of Epsandrum, I'll put that as a quite salient link on our episode page for people to check out. So let's move on to what I thought caused my eyebrows to actually go up, And that is your claim that this is approximately an all or nothing phenomenon.
Yeah. Okay. Again, it's something which I'm out on a limb there. Even my closest colleagues like Dan Dennett argue for continuity. He thinks that phenomenal consciousness, sentience, exists in all possible degrees, from hemi, demi, semi bits of consciousness right the way up to what we ourselves experience. Well, my starting point is to say, well, that's not what it's like for me. For me, it's an all or nothing phenomenon. When I go to sleep, it cuts off completely. And when I recover from consciousness again, it comes back all of a piece. I don't go through stages of hemi, semi, demi consciousness. I mean, a bit of confusion maybe, but, colors and lights and sounds and fields are all there with their qualities pretty much all at once. And if that can happen in my own life, and as it presumably happened in the history of my body, as I developed from being a fetus to being a conscious being, I think this thing switched on somewhere. And the kind of model I've got would make sense of that, because these feedback loops do have all or none properties. Feedback loop either is active or it cuts out. I mean, we're all familiar with that kind of thing in annoying demonstrations, like when you move a microphone too close to a loudspeaker and suddenly, whoop, and it takes off and you can't shut the stupid thing off until you actually cut the circuit, and then it suddenly disappears again. But it's all or nothing. I think that that's likely to have been the way in which it evolved. These loops developed pretty quickly over the course of evolution, given certain circumstances which we may talk about, like the evolution of warm-bloodedness. But something happened which made them suddenly fire up and become a dominant feature of our brain. And so I think that in thinking about animals, and of course thinking about machines too, we should expect that this kind of consciousness will again be all or nothing. I don't think it goes down in smaller and smaller degrees right the way through the animal kingdom, nor is it already present in the kind of primitive machines which we're dealing with. We're not there yet with machines, and most animals never got there. This is, of course, in some sense, thoroughly anti-Darwinian. Darwin wrote in The Origin of Species in The Descent of Man, that psychology will be put on a new foundation. The gradual emergence of psychological factors from primitive beginnings with complete continuity. Well, we've got other parallels. Something like language doesn't seem to have taken that course. It's pretty much an all or nothing phenomenon, and it emerges as an all or nothing phenomenon in human development. I think that we should be looking at animals and not asking, can we see glimmers of earlier stages of consciousness there, of this kind of consciousness, because it won't be there. And it will have acquired a specific brain circuitry which had this, essentially, had this inbuilt switch.
Yeah, that's a very interesting idea. And as I mentioned in the pre-show, it is unfortunately captured my brain, or maybe fortunately, as something to really seriously think about, particularly in our work about machine consciousness, is something like this of the essence. I haven't gotten to the point where I say yes, but I haven't gotten to the point where I say no. So thank you very much for that contribution to the thinking about it.
Don't tell Carl Freshnam.
Oh, no, he will. I know he's a good idea. In fact, I will. I'm going to actually ask him. I'm going to have him on one of these days, and I'm going to ask him specifically. And of course, he's going to say, nope, it's free energy from top to bottom. I have my own doubts about that, by the way, which is that if you think about emergence and systems, seldom do you see emergences that penetrate layers, right? For instance, the emergences that occur within the neuronal range do not penetrate down into the intercellular range in cells other than the neurons, right? So that not in a direct way, they operate at a higher level of emergence in terms of nutrition or respiration or gases or something. But the probability that there's one principle to rule them all from layer to layer through emergent layers seems to me rather unlikely.
Although there are very clever people like Mike Levin, whom I think you've interviewed, who actually argue convincingly that there could be that kind of continuity.
And again, I haven't had him in on yet, but I will soon. And again, I will certainly have that discussion on whether his Evo-Devo signaling arguments actually do explain it all. I have my doubts. I believe that you have to take emergence seriously, and that there are emergent layers and things happen that are not fully isolated, but that we have to think about in new ways. But anyway, that's neither here nor maybe it actually is sort of relevant. Where do you come down on that in terms of thinking about whether ipsundrum, what the fuck you pronounce that? Anyway, whether that is, to what degree is it a phenomenon of the realm of body neuronal systems versus a manifestation of some greater single theory that explains it all?
I think it's an emergent event unknown in the history of the universe before that. So yeah, it's something very special. And you said earlier, what an extraordinary series of chance events brought us here. I think just so it was an extraordinary series of chance event, and it probably wouldn't go the same way if it was repeated. I don't think we can count on phenomenal consciousness with these special circuits arising anywhere else in nature. And in an infinite universe, you might want to say, well, of course, anything can arise in an infinite universe, and technically that's true. And yet I put my money on the possibility that phenomenal consciousness as it's evolved here on Earth. It doesn't exist anywhere else, which gives us an awful responsibility. It's bad enough being,
I talk about that quite a bit. Fermi paradox is one of the things I talk about probably the most, right? You've already beat me to it. I often will ask scientific guests, all right, give me your take on the Fermi paradox. And your answer is probably ain't none, right? First, I reject infinite universes on principle that I find infinities unesthetic, right? Because the problem with an infinite universe is there's an infinite number of you and I having this exact same discussion inside of a Boltzmann brain with mild variations and an infinite number of each of those. No infinities, please. No. The universe is at least causally finite. And whether there are other causally finite universes out there that aren't connected to ours, I don't know or care. Well, actually, I care, but I don't know. All right. And so I assume a causally finite universe, basically our light cone. So I don't have to worry about Boltzmann brains or crazy shit like that. Essentially, that's what I think is quite useful. This issue of the importance of the possible uniqueness of phenomenal consciousness and sentience together is something I talk about a lot. And it's something that just tortures me, right? And as I talk about the future of humanity over the next 10,000 years, assuming we exist for 10,000 years, seems like a questionable bet on some days, not on others. That's the key question, right? If it turns out that the workings through the Drake equation produced tens of thousands of technological civilizations in the galaxy, or even 100, then our level of responsibility to bring the universe to life seems less. We can take higher risks. But it turns out that after 10,000 years of exploration, sending probes out to numerous stars, gigantic sensors in space, the answer is it's all dead matter, people. Then we have a very different responsibility to the universe, at least so I would argue, which is to preserve this thing. First life, and then phenomenal consciousness, and then general intelligence. Holy shit! That's the final emergence that we couldn't have.
Jim, but I wouldn't try to cut the cake quite like that, because I suspect that life exists in many places in the universe. I think inevitably it wants to, and intelligence will almost certainly exist in many places, and cognitive consciousness probably will do too. It's this very peculiar development, which may be just a one-off, but nonetheless is at the center, the most valuable thing in our own lives, which is phenomenal experience. That, I think, is, we can't count at all and having been replicated. But the universe doesn't, in some sense, need it. All sorts of technical civilizations could evolve without it. They might have some serious failings in this area, which I've mentioned already, which is theory of mind. That is an area in which I think that possibly we can steal a march on anything which isn't phenomenally conscious. They'd have to have workarounds. AI will have to have workarounds in order to develop theory of mind, but there may be some workarounds which are possible.
Or it may actually have theory of mind, right?
It might have theory of mind if it was sentient, yeah. Well, it might have theory of mind, but using an alternative route. I think it's not, it could be done. It's not the way nature did it.
I'm going to push back a little bit on your speculation. I've done a shitload of thinking and reading about the Fermi paradox. I'm not sure about how common life is, right? My friend Stuart Kaufman would say, yeah, it's everywhere at the bacterial level or something close to that. I don't know. Very hard to get across the bridge of DNA, even at the, and all the error checking machinery to avoid the error catastrophe in evolution. The mathematics of evolution don't work unless you have fidelity of copying above X. And how do you evolve the fidelity of copying above X without it? Goddamn hard question. But maybe you get to that one. So then you get bacteria. And so I'll say, okay, bacteria more likely, but I don't know what likelihood. And then what about the crazy thing that went from the prokaryotic to the eukaryotic? How the hell did that happen? As far as we know, only happened once, right? And even if you got bacteria, what's the chance of making a leap like that to get something interesting, right? And then you go, okay, so we got amoebas and paramecia and things of that sort. Then we have to get, but numerous kinds of multicellularity, but only one that led to anything that could even be arguably sentient, and that is that whatever happened right before the Cambrian explosion, where cells organize in a specific way, and the neurons, which appeared to have evolved just prior to that, became central to the behavior of these characters called animals at a ever ratcheting scale. What the hell was the chances of that happening? So you stack all those things up.
Well, I like that. I mean, worrying as it is, I also think it's glorious to think that what we've got is unparalleled in the rest of the universe. It does, as you say, give us a big responsibility. When I say life is prevalent in the universe, I don't mean that prevalent. I don't think it's necessary. It's not going to be present in the solar system. We're not going to find it on Mars or any evidence of it. I don't think, because of just the kind of reasons you're talking about. And anyway, it would be at such a low level, it wouldn't have passed all those other tests which you mentioned.
Yeah, though on the other hand, I try to maintain a radical agnosticism about all this. We'll get some data soon from Mars and from Enceladus and Io and a few of these other ones. That, for instance, we find something that is analogous to human Earth life, Earth life in Enceladus, in an undersea, under ice sea, heated by gravitational tidal waves inside of the moon of Saturn. That will tell us something very different. Stewart was right. You throw the chemicals together, you get life every fucking time, right? I would put a bet down against it, but for this moment, we're close enough to knowing that I'll just suspend my opinion too strongly until we get the evidence one way or the other. Within 100 years, we'll know the answer to that one. We're rapidly gaining power to understand exoatmospheres. And of course, there's lots of arguments about that. And some of those may give reasonably conclusive evidence that there is life or not life of anything like ours based on our increasing ability to examine exoplanet atmospheres. So again, agnosticism, 10,000 years worth of agnosticism. We'll get data every year.
Yeah, but the thing is, in the areas you're talking about, at least you can agree to differ on them, and you don't all hate each other. Humans do often can be close friends. And interesting thing about the consciousness studies is that everybody hates everybody else, and because there are some real disagreements, and I think you were hinting at some of those earlier on. I mean, panpsychism and Dan's and my kind of materialism are just not compatible. And Dan would go so far as to say that those other bad ideas are actually morally repugnant because they mislead people. That's badly argued. They make believe in a way which is totally correctable, and yet people won't see it. So in my book, I do take on at least something like integrated information theory, which has been described recently by a whole group of other scientists as a pseudo-science. I don't quite use that word, but I do make fun of it as a really empty theory. And yet it's making the running. I mean, what's astonishing is I don't understand the history of science at the moment. Bad ideas bubble to the surface and stay there. I used to argue with Dan Dennett. I'd say, Dan, look, we've got a problem here. I don't think we're winning this argument at the moment. We ought to be, but for some reason or other, we simply just haven't got the zeitgeist, and it's slipping away from us. And I just had an argument with, there's a memorial event for Dan Dennett being organized at Tufts University. Who is speaking there? Well, Dave Chalmers and Tanoni are both represented. And I said, well, look, but they were Dan's intellectual foes.
You put a generator on his coffin, see how much electricity you can generate as it spins.
If he's listening in, he's going to hate it. So, I think it's not fair to have people knocking a man when he's down, too.
Yeah, it is interesting that this domain attracts crazy ideas. I will say, when I first stumbled upon IIT, I don't know, 2014, something like that, I go, holy shit. And then I spent some time thinking about it, and I read some of the works of people who had refuted it very easily in the first form, right? And I come away with still the same view I've had about it ever since, which is I suspect anything that is actually conscious will have a high phi. But things that have high phi are by no means conscious. Right?
Right. Yeah, which makes it basically a useless theory.
Yeah. Though, maybe a side check on something like machine consciousness. Can you approximate phi for this machine and say that it is high? That doesn't say it is conscious, but if you calculated phi and it wasn't high, you do the high phi, right? Then it's not conscious. So I do think it's not entirely useless. But the claim that your thermostat has one bit of consciousness strikes me as entirely ridiculous.
But I suppose, look, each to his own. Long time ago, it is a long time ago now, I promised myself I would solve the problem of consciousness before I died. I'm not unhappy with where I've got to, but neither would Christoph Koch be. So he's going to die happy with what I think is a silly theory, and I can die happy with my own. So lucky, there's room for all of us.
And the thing, as long as we don't, as you say, have to, anyway, we'll leave the fighting aside. We have to move quickly here. We're getting late in our time. We've had so much fun talking about so many cool things. Again, a new idea for me, and one that is going to plague me for a while, is qualophilia. This is really a quite interesting idea. And, part of your thought about how do we know if we're talking about this thing that you call sentience, and including the distinction between consciousness. So talk a little bit about what is qualophilia and how would one, think about noticing its existence?
Well, qualia and philia, I'm just combining the word love and qualia. Qualia are states of phenomenal experience, and philia means, I'll urge to go out and fill the world with them and experience them. Why would that be something we'd expect? Because in my theory of what the function of qualia and phenomenal consciousness is, which is to build up a sense of self, I call it the phenomenal self, that's something which is every animal has to work at. We aren't born with a ready-made phenomenal self, all full of this mystery and these experiences which make us think of ourselves and other people as being so significant. We need, from the moment we're born, to charge it up, to fill the batteries. And that means from the moment we enter the world, we are going to be out seeking experience for its own sake. Not necessarily seeking experience because it's useful to us, because it's going to help us with hunting and gathering or whatever it may be. Seeking it in order to fill out the sense of what it's like to be a human being, because we need to know that in order to know what it's like to be other people in all their huge variety, with all their unlikely experiences. And so I think built into animals like ourselves, conscious animals like ourselves, is a very strong drive to just go out and enrich experience, to just live it up and feel whatever's out there, to feel all the possible ways of being a human being. And so then I say, well, it's not difficult to see evidence of that in human beings. We only have to look at little children and what the exploratory games and everything they get into, and see how this develops in adults too. We never let go of this drive to learn more about what it's like to be us. Could we see something similar in animals? And if we did, would that be good evidence that they have gone the same route, that they too have a phenomenal self in waiting, which they have to fill out through direct experience? And so, in the book I suggest a whole lot of possible areas we might look for evidence of animals seeking sensations for sensation's sake, not for practical, functional reasons, but simply because it's of the glories of experiencing and filling out this inner sense of self. And so I'm fairly clinical about it. I say, well, I think we can do this, and it doesn't on the whole necessarily give the answers we want. If you look at an octopus, for example, we don't see octopuses enjoying experience for its own sake. They don't play in the ways which we see a bird or a mouse or, of course, a puppy dog doing. They don't go out and just simply revel in experience. And perhaps the reason they don't do that is because they don't care what it's like to be themselves, because they never think about what it's like to be another octopus. Octopuses don't apparently have theory of mind, and they don't have it because they don't need it. octopus's social life is really pretty damn basic. It's not, they simply don't need to have a theory of mind and that kind of social intelligence. And I think they don't have it. And part of that is not being phenomenally conscious. So, yeah, we can test that octopuses see, do they show what I call qualophilia? People like Nicky Clayton are actually doing just that. They don't entirely agree to me about what they find. I mean, Lars Chitka has argued that he can see evidence of bumblebees playing for the sake of playing, just rolling balls around because of the thrill of the experience. Again, I'm not convinced by the evidence, but at least it's a good place to look, and I think that it is something we can in principle investigate. So yeah, in the book I discuss all these fascinating questions, like, do animals like music? Answer is not very much.
Yeah, it seems like. I mean, there is this line between humans and everybody else. I mean, yet another emergence, probably around language or Terence Deacon's theories around symbols, which then he concatenated into language, etc.
I should just say, since we're being highbrow about music and things, there's one thing which a lot of animals do, and they masturbate. And that's an interesting example of sensation for sensation's sake. But again, how far does that go? All mammals do it. Not so always that invertebrates do.
Yeah, the whole thing I skipped was the bodily perception versus the phenomenal mind, which is interesting, but only so much you can do in 90 minutes. We've done quite a lot here. One final question I have for you before we leave. In the league table of who has sentience and who doesn't, you basically say mammals and birds. My first question, but the first thing that seems obvious to me, thinking from an evolutionary lens, is, wait a minute, birds and mammals are related, but way back 200 million years before the dinosaurs, right? And to amphibians, and then earliest proto-reptiles. So just hypothesizing, do you think birds and mammals evolved sentience independently, or was there a proto-sentience in pre-reptiles or amphibians that then just evolved in different directions, but parallel evolution across the two chains?
Obviously, an interesting question. Were dinosaurs sentient? I think that it may have been that in a primitive ancestor of both mammals and birds. I suspect that just in terms of the engineering of the brain which was required, that it depended on evolving homeothermy of warm-bloodedness, because that changed an awful lot of what was going on in brains, and something which people don't take on board, so they should have done, is that when you move from having a regular temperature of, let's say, 12 degrees centigrade to having 37, 38, 40 in birds, the speed of conduction of nerve cells dramatically increases by about 4 times. Now, that's a rather big thing in the evolution and development of brain. I mean, brain size matters, but within the brain, how fast these neurons are working probably matters just as much. So something almost certainly changed of great importance when mammals and birds became, or their ancestors became, warm-blooded. And I look at what was going on in the lives of these animals and say, well, yes, okay, something also was happening there, because what warm-bloodedness does is to release you from the constraints of the physical environment, and that could have given animals at that point a new sense of their own self-importance, because they became autonomous in ways which had never been before, able to move around the earth and be active day and night, almost without limit, not completely without limit. That gives you psychologically a new sense of self. And just at that point, if the brain was changing, it could have been that the phenomenal self kicked in, this sense of myself as something also outside of nature, which has this kind of spiritual quality. So just as we took to the air in real life, I think our brains were taking to the air like an angel.
That's a very interesting point. If you found this at all interesting, go read this book. I mean, this is a really good book, I got to tell you. Sentience, The Invention of Consciousness by Nick Humphrey. And I want to thank you, Nick, for a truly interesting conversation here today.
Jim, it's a real privilege to talk to you.
It's been great fun. Audio production and editing by Andrew Blevins Productions. Music by Tom Muller at modernspacemusic.com.